Hi everyone, welcome to episode 22 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. In this episode, I interview Lee Jasper. Lee is the co-founder and CEO of Aconex, which provides cloud collaboration solutions for the global construction industry. Aconex completed their IPO in 2014 and now serves projects worth over $800 billion from its 41 offices worldwide and has a market cap of over $1 billion. In the interview, Lee shares his insights on why you need to have domain expertise to succeed, the ingredients of a compelling pitch, why good founders learn to let go, and his approach on when and how to expand internationally. Without further ado, here is my interview with Lee Jasper. Hi Lee, welcome to the Startup Playbook Podcast, and thanks for taking the time to be on the show today.
No worries, great to be here.
So for those people that maybe aren't as familiar with you or the Aconex story, can you talk a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I studied engineering. I did mechanical engineering at Melbourne University along with mathematics and French, and then went into, during my university days, did some summer work as an engineer. Decided I didn't really want to be an engineer as much as I did kind of enjoy the work, but really wanted to get into the business side of things. And then after university, went to McKinsey & Company for a couple of years before then founding Aconex.
Sure. What if anything, kind of instigated that transition for you from working at McKinsey into starting your own business?
At the time I was at McKinsey, firstly, I came from a small business background anyway, so my parents had run a small business. I was always interested in the business side, and of course McKinsey was a great environment to learn about business, I guess on a larger scale. When I was at McKinsey, I had the good fortune of being involved in a lot of advice to projects with essentially technology-related projects around the internet. So, a number of the clients I worked with over those 2 years at McKinsey were all looking at what the internet would do for their business, positive or negative. And so I came from an engineering background. I knew the internet at least a little bit, and was taken onto these projects, and so I had a great opportunity to be exposed to how businesses were thinking about the impact that the internet would have on their companies. And during that, I just thought, the internet is going to radically or fundamentally change the way we do business, and thought there had to be an opportunity to do something related to that. And Rob Phillpot, the other co-founder, he was working out at Multiplex at the time, managing projects, and as we talked more about what the internet was doing across industries, we thought there was this real opportunity to use to bring the internet, or to bring an internet-enabled platform into the market to streamline the way people work on construction projects. So that was really the genesis of the business. Looking for an opportunity to use the internet to make it easier for people to work together on projects.
Sure. I've talked on the podcast with a couple of the guests that have come from a corporate or a management consulting background. Sometimes in the startup space, we don't appreciate some of the skills that people acquire from going through that process. Was there anything in particular that you learnt from McKinsey that allowed you to grow Aconex into what it is now?
I think, it's a few things. Firstly, of course, being exposed to a whole lot of different businesses and how they run, I think is one thing. So you don't just see one business, you see a lot of businesses. And McKinsey, obviously the way they looked at business and the way they thought about strategy was really critical in terms of how we thought about the genesis of the business and what we're going to do. I think also one of the simple things was being able to present and prepare a presentation. I think one of the keys for any startup is you've got to be able to pitch what you're doing and raise money. And frankly, I don't think Australians generally do that as well as we could. I think that's an area that most Australians are probably not as strong at as, say, Americans or other nationalities. And I think having that ability to pull together a presentation, pull together a story about what we were looking to do within the industry was important. I think that going back to the strategy side was being able to think through the dynamics in the industry and how our product and the business, the model, if you like, the go-to-market was going to, change the industry, where there were opportunities to improve the way people worked. So a lot of little things, and of course the other thing, some bigger things as well, but lots of different aspects. I think the other interesting one for us was we were able to raise money from some of the McKinsey directors. So having access to a set of high net worth individuals that you've worked with, that trust you and are looking to invest in businesses. So we were very fortunate I was fortunate to have the McKinsey background, but also to have this network of people from McKinsey that, whether they were still at McKinsey or had left, were looking to invest in businesses. So a lot of our first round was raised from people that were associated with McKinsey.
Sure. One thing that you mentioned there was that Australians perhaps aren't as strong at pitching as people from the US. Do you think there's a particular reason for that?
I think we undersell what we do. There's a lot of positives in the Australian culture about not big noting yourself and being a little bit more humble. I think around how we operate. That's a good thing, but when you're pitching a business, you need to tell the story. And I think I lived over in Silicon Valley for 4 years, and you'd see Australian companies come through, and the American companies would talk to why they're they're leading their space. It might be a very small space, but they talk to why they're a market leader and how they're going to change a particular industry. Australians would come over and rather than talk to the positives of what their business is doing, they'd often sort of undersell it and we've only got 15 people and we've only got to this stage, we're only 5 million in revenue or whatever, which is still amazing for some of these companies, but they just wouldn't necessarily position it in the most positive light. And I think just being really crisp around how we tell stories about our businesses and how we pitch them to investors, I think it's an area that Australians just need to get. I mean, any start. Frankly, if you're not good at it, it's going to be very hard to raise money. So for any startup, I'd say just get good at pitching your business, get good at telling the story. Whether you've got 30 seconds to tell it, or whether you've got 5 minutes or 10 minutes, work out your various pitches and get good at them.
Sure. On that, do you have any specific strategies that you would say makes up a good pitch?
I think making the story accessible to people. So in our case, a lot of our early investors understood construction, so we talked to the problems that we were solving and made it real for people. I think it's very, sometimes we can get wrapped up in our own technology, but just keeping the message really simple, making it accessible for the layman to understand what we're doing. I think keeping it short and sharp. I always like understanding how the business model is going to work. That's me, but I think that's helpful. But I think just being confident in what you're building and how it's going to change an industry and what the potential opportunity is, the potential size, without taking. I think the other thing people make the mistake is they'll go and say we'll be the Uber of X, or we'll be the Facebook of blah, and we've got a multi-trillion-dollar market. Well, if it's that amazing, why haven't other people done it? And frankly, Uber didn't go out to be the Uber of anything; they just went out to be Uber. So just finding whatever business it is, just talk about the strengths of the business. You don't have to kind of replicate another business model into a market. I think that's in some ways a cop-out, telling a story about just saying I'm just going to be the X of Y. So
sure.
The Facebook of construction or whatever. I don't know. It's just at the end of the day, I think you really talking to the business model and why it will change things, rather than just saying, well, we've taken this business model from another vertical and applied it into this market.
So a couple of our listeners may be in a position where you were back in 2000, working in a corporate space. They might have an idea, or they might sort of want to transition. Was there anything that you kind of used to help from that transition? Was there any work that you did on validating the problem with Aconex before you made the jump? So
we put together a business plan before we left our respective jobs, Rob at Multiplex and myself at McKinsey. We were clearly running our jobs, but on the side, weekends or whatever, we were starting to prepare things and getting ready. I think the benefit I had, something from the McKinsey side, is they'll allow you to go out and do what they call a fellowship. And I was looking potentially going to business school, and often people will use that as an opportunity to go and work in a different business or do something different. And for me, that was starting Aconex, which obviously never quite got back to McKinsey. But I think in terms of what I think, the other thing I would say about those, we didn't have. It's good to do it early in the sense that I didn't have a mortgage, didn't have any kids. I was married, but still am married to the same wife. But we didn't have any kids at the time. We didn't have a mortgage, so there was nothing to lose in a sense. And I think there's an optimal time for starting a business, and I think it's much harder if you've got commitments and a mortgage to pay, all those sort of things. So I think there's no time like the present just to go and have a go. But I think setting a time where if it doesn't work, you stop. I think where you always had a belief in what we were doing, and but it was tough. There was times where you go, were you going to make it through? But we always had this belief that we had a business model that could work. I think there has to be a point where I guess the music stops, but we were fortunately able to get raise the investment and get customers on pretty early, and that's what got us going. But it was tough. I mean, it was hard yards those early years, and back then, of course, go back to early 2000s, the internet was. I mean, the paradigm was a dial-up modem. So we were getting construction companies to use the internet to deliver projects when some of them didn't have the internet on site, or at best they had a dial-up modem, and many of them didn't even have computers on site. So these companies had to go through change. But our view, we were looking out, into the future and sort of saying, well, the internet's going to be everywhere. We had a belief on that, and thankfully that was right. It's going to get faster, which we were right. I think we massively underestimated the amount of data that we would handle, but thankfully the internet got faster and data storage costs came down. But we always had this view that we would be able to build a business around that, and we were patient enough. We built a business that didn't assume it was all going to happen overnight as well. I think that can be the other mistake. Businesses can go too fast too early, and if you're paddling out before the wave, then you're as likely to fail as if you miss the wave.
Sure. That was actually going to be my next question, which was how's business or the environment changed from when you first started back in 2000 to what things are like now?
So clearly the internet, I mean, that's obviously very different. The other thing, of course, is being able to host, use AWS, you spin up, or other hosting services, spin up an instance and you're away. Spin up some servers. Back then we had to literally buy our hardware. We ran the full stack we'd co-locate in the data center, so we'd hire rack space, but then what we'd do is we'd run everything from there. So we ran our hardware, we ran all of the infrastructure from the hardware layer right up to the application. These days, of course, you just have to run the app and everything else is done for you. So I think it's a lot easier from that point of view. We literally spent, our first raise, which was a bit less than $2 million, we'd spent, $500,000, maybe even more, $750,000 just on hardware and the base operating software, which we then ended up rebuilding ourselves. But that's, there was a lot of money just out the door before we'd done anything. That's different. So I think it would have been very hard back then to kick off a company with $50,000, whereas I think you can do that these days. That said, I think the scaling issues are still the same. I think it's probably easier to get to that initial, get to a minimum viable product out into the market, get a few customers. I think from that point on, it's very much the same. Scaling is always hard, and you've got to think through how that's going to work for the business, and really think through what the various stages of that are. I think getting those choices wrong around what you build and how much you put into sales or support or marketing or whatever the function is, getting those balances right, I think is still the same. You've got to think clearly about that. I think in the investment environment is probably better now too. I think there's more people looking to invest. That said, Australia is not necessarily the easiest environment, particularly from a growth equity point of view. Past that early stage, I think it gets harder to get money in Australia.
Sure. I definitely want to touch on some of the issues that you face scaling, but I guess looking back you mentioned that you raised $2 million in funding.
Yeah,
was that
a bit less than that? Yeah, around that. Yeah.
Was that?
That was just an initial round. We raised before we had a private equity group invest in 2008, and before that we'd raised I think $25 to $30 million in Australia. So a couple of smaller rounds, and then we did a couple of bigger rounds, essentially just from high net worths. I mean, it wasn't until the Francisco Partners round in 2008 that we brought in an institutional investor. Sure.
Was that before you had a product or before you had clients in place?
That first raise we had nothing. I mean, it was a business plan. It was, two blokes, Rob and myself, with a business plan, and it wasn't even a colour business plan. It was probably black and white back then. It was pretty expensive to print in colour, and that was the plan. We raised money off the back of that. But I think at the end of the day, it wasn't just a plan. We had a vision for what we were going to do, and people bought into that. But there was nothing. I mean, there was no product.
Yeah, but I mean, it was also the relationships, as you mentioned, that you had fostered over time. So it wasn't just
it wasn't just we
were sending off to people.
It wasn't just we sort of rolled up on somebody's doorstep, but we had relationships we'd built. We'd obviously, we had people both from my consulting background, but also from Rob's construction background, that sort of came together into family invested a bit as well. So we were able to cobble together that round, and then from then on, we raised a lot of it ourselves. So each round we'd go out then to other high net worths and build out in the investor base.
Sure. And what did the first few months of Aconex look like? How did you get your first few clients on board? What were some of the challenges that you faced starting out?
So initially it was getting a couple of clients on. So I had to go and do a lot of sales. So that was one of the things I sort of picked up on, was the sales side, and that, frankly, was hard work. That 6 months of having to go out and sell was probably the hardest 6 months I've ever had in work in my life. And there's a view that if you can build a great product, some businesses can build a great product and not need a lot in sales. I think for vast majority of business, that's just not going to work. In our case, a construction project manager doesn't know that he needs Aconex. He or she has been busy delivering the project. They're fighting fires all the time. They're trying to coordinate all the different subcontractors, etc. on the project. The last thing they're thinking about is a collaboration platform, or at least back then they just didn't know it existed. So we had to go and highlight to people what the opportunity was around using a collaboration tool to deliver their projects, and that required going out and speaking to people on the phone and going out and seeing people. So it was a lot of face-to-face sales initially, just getting people comfortable, getting people up and going on the platform, and then supporting the hell out of them, making sure we were there, holding their hand. And what we saw is anytime you got a customer onto a project, there's an opportunity then to get them onto more projects. So go in and then, the sale didn't finish when somebody signed an order. The sale finished, or never finishes. You're continually expanding that customer. And even today, customers that we started with a few projects, like a multiplex started with one, they were probably a couple of years after we started, but multiplex started with a project or two, and now they run everything on Aconex. Companies like ProBuild, one of our early clients, Hanson Youngkin, another early client, they started with a project or two and then scaled up their use of the platform. And today those customers have been long-term, 15-year customers that use this across everything now.
Sure. One of the things that you mentioned about the environment back then was, the internet isn't what it was back then. So I assume that there were probably additional challenges apart from just selling your solution that you would have faced in getting your first few clients especially on board. Was there anything that you used to kind of help ease some of those concerns?
Well, one of the things was people often didn't know what the internet was, so we had to explain, we'd explain what the internet is, the problem they had, which they understood the problem, and then of course how we could solve that. We looked at things like, and we never really did this in the end, but we looked at maybe selling people computers and internet access bundles and those sort of things. But thankfully, it had started to move, so we didn't have to do that. We didn't really end up doing that because people were able to get that themselves, thankfully. But we just had to explain what it was, and it did mean a lot of customers. And we had customers back then that I remember one customer who only had one email address for the whole company. And that was how they ran their business. So they'd get emails in, and then they'd go and print out the emails and put it into everybody's pigeonhole. So the industry's changed dramatically over that period. And I think, but one of the things we found was once you get a few reference clients and a couple of customers that are using it, it's very easy then, or it's easier to go to their competitors and say, well, look at what so-and-so is doing, and that sort of helped. The other thing was using this network effect that we have. So when we bring on one company, they bring on their supply chain, all the architects, the engineers, the subcontractors that are involved in those projects. And also if they're a contractor, they bring the owner, or the owner might bring the contractor on. So we use that network to help build. So we get into a project and we then use the relationships we built or developed through that project engagement to then push out onto other projects.
Sure. And obviously it sounds like you and Rob had a very strong understanding of the space and the industry that you were operating in, and that's something that a lot of investors especially talk about. Can you explain why it is really important to have kind of domain expertise in the business that you're starting?
I think in our case, and look, I think this is probably true of all startups and all businesses, we, particularly Rob, really knew the problem that we were solving for our customers, so we could go out and talk to that problem. And I think if you don't quite understand, if you don't have that domain expertise, if you don't quite get the product right, you often don't get a second chance. So, people talk about pivoting that. Well, yeah, you can, and we did to some degree actually in the early days, but you don't get many chances. So if you don't get it right, and you need to be able to iterate it, but if you don't get it at least directionally right, it's going to be very hard to do that. And then I think it's listening to customers and then understand. So understanding the market's clearly important, but then what we did was really engage with our customers, listen to them, listen to what their problems were, and you also have to almost go a level below what they're saying, because a customer might have a problem and they don't necessarily know how they can solve it, and they can't necessarily see that you could solve it the way you think you might be able to solve it. And so it's almost looking ahead to where's the market going, how do we build something the market doesn't know it needs yet, But given the problems they've got, they're going to need it, or they're going to, if we're assuming we can deliver that product for them, then they're going to see that's a massive advantage for them.
Sure. And so fast forwarding to today, from what I understand, you've got over 40 different offices around the world, in almost pretty much every continent as well. What are some of the challenges that you faced over time in growing out that team, or just scaling the company as a whole?
So clearly, working across a lot of markets, a lot of offices has challenges. But I think what we did early on was we would get, we'd build with locals in our team. So in each of our markets, we'll try and build locals into the team as much as possible. So for example, our Asia business, we might have 1 or 2 Australians in the business, but the other, whatever it is, 60 or 70 people in that business, or that part of our business, are all locally based. So the Chinese in China, Indian in India, whatever it is. And that's, I think, really important. But the other thing is overlaying that is having one culture and one. So we act as one company globally. We've really reinforced our values and one set of values and operating principles across the business. But then within each market, you of course have the local team. They are part of that company. They are part of the values, part of the operating systems. But then we allow them to adapt to the local markets within that, and particularly how they engage with clients. So again, we set a certain set of standards and principles across the business, and then the teams then engage with their local markets. But finding good people has always been a challenge. Operating globally, I could be on email 24/7. So you've got to, as much as anything, also set boundaries. Otherwise, you just burn out. But we would follow customers. So we'd look for opportunities in markets. So if there's a customer who's working in a region we wanted to get into, we may have worked with them in another region. We'd look for ways to extend into those other regions. So always look for vectors of growth that we can follow to get into those new accounts, and then persevere to stay in there and keep pushing. A market like China, for example, we've been in for 10 years. We're getting some good business there, but we're still scraping the surface of the opportunity. But having been in that market for some time, built up a customer base, it continues to get easier. But you've got to stay the course. I think what we saw in the Middle East, for example, we had a really strong business there. When the GFC hit, 1 or 2 of our competitors pulled back from the region and then tried to re-enter. I think it was really hard for them to do that. What we'd done was keep a business there. We did resize it, but we kept a presence in the market. And that, I think, gave trust to customers that we were there for the long haul. We weren't going to pull up stumps and go home. I think that's something that, being able to commit and persevere in a market has been key for us.
Sure. You mentioned that you follow the customers. Is there any particular stage where you say we've got enough customers now that we now need to set up an office here to support that space?
Yes, that's true. So often what happens is we get projects with customers before we look to set up an office. Once we get to the point where we need a person or two, that's often where we'd set up an office. Not in all cases. I mean, we work in an office in, I guess, 20 odd countries, but we work in projects in well over 60 countries. So we don't have offices in every country. There are a lot of projects in places like Africa where we don't have local offices in some of those countries, but we serve projects there. But once it gets to a certain scale and we think it's there's enough business there, then we'll set up a local office.
Sure. And talking to James Catamol about a similar sort of thing, about him setting up offices in the US, and talking about sort of slight cultural differences and overcoming that. Obviously, with your offices in Asia and the Middle East, there are more cultural differences. How do you sort of manage the different cultural differences of people that you're hiring in those regions versus the internal culture that you're trying to create across the country?
Yeah, I think the main thing there is trying to hire for a common set of values. So we want diversity in the business. We want diversity of thought and diversity of views, and to bring the best of that thinking together. But you still want a commonality in terms of how people, so for example, we want people that act with integrity. We want them to put the client first. So we've got a number of values that we talk about internally, and we look for company, or for people rather, that can fit into the company around that culture, around those values. I think in each of those markets we expect that there'll be some local differences, but we still want to hold to that set of values and a common set of standards and principles around behaviour that we want our staff to adhere to. In markets like the US, every market's different. In the US, the mistake people can make with the US is thinking it's very much like Australia. When you go to China, it's going to be different. When you go to the US, there's an assumption that it's similar. In many ways, that's more of a trap, because when you go into a market like China, it's different. You plan for that, you work around it. a trap in the US can be you don't put enough time into actually understanding the cultural differences, and we found that as we were setting up in the US, there's just some different approaches to things, different approaches to the market, different ways of doing things that we needed to adapt to.
Sure. And I mean, obviously you've been with Aconex for 16 years, just over 16 years. How has your role changed and evolved over that time?
So clearly in the early days, Rob and I did everything, in the sense that we were, we covered sort of a lot of the different executive roles. We were part-time marketers, part-time salespeople, part-time, finance people, part-time everything. But so as the business has got bigger, we've been able to bring in, executives that are deeper in their various functional areas, and that's not just functional, but also from a management point of view across our regions. We've brought in, we've essentially created a business that has a lot of those functions. But also, the good thing is you end up with a better marketer than what I could do, or a better, sales manager than what I could ever be. So that broadening of the business was something good. I mean, we're still involved across a lot, in the sense that the strategic setting, that setting of strategic direction, how we engage, the market, how we want to compete with people, all those sort of things you're still thinking through. You're thinking through it on a bigger scale, but a lot of the execution then is delegated out. So, as a founder, actually, you want to, as much as anything, get away. The hardest thing is to actually let go, and I think that can be the trap of any founder. If you don't let go, and you won't get good people coming in, because they won't have the autonomy to make decisions, and you've got to accept that people are going to do different things differently. And again, it's finding out where you want to. There's times where I'll push back on the team. There's times where I'll let them go. But getting, it's hard to know always the right path to take. I think you've got to have softer hands as you build the business more broadly, and allow people to make decisions, allow people to make mistakes, and step back a bit from some of the things we used to do. And you just have to do it as a founder. You can't manage everything, and the founders that I think don't scale are the ones that try and keep too much control over everything. I think the better way to control a business is not so much around the day-to-day decision making, but rather setting the direction for the business, setting the strategy, setting a vision that people buy into, and using that, more of the inspiration and the motivation rather than the day-to-day kind of micromanagement of how people work. And but that's a challenge. When there's 20 people, you can do that almost one-on-one. But we've got we're over 800 people. We're at a scale now where it has to be done through system. When I say system, I don't mean physical systems necessarily, or software systems. I mean more the way we communicate out a vision. There's a system around that allows us to communicate out where we want to go over the next few years, why we're doing that, what our plans are for this year, and then that sort of cascades down to goals for the business. So you end up much more steering the ship rather than down the boiler room. But and that's all equally important. But you can't, if you're trying to run the ship, set the direction of the ship, and you're still down the boiler room, you're not going to build a great business.
Absolutely. I mean, I know that's something I personally struggled with my own startup, and similarly with other founders that I've spoken to, had a similar sort of challenge. With that, is there a sort of a conscious point where you go, I need to stop being in the boiler room and be in charge a little bit more of strategy?
I think it's where you get people, ideally if you can get people who are better at it than you are, so whatever function it is, marketing, sales, whatever, if you can get in people who are better at that function than you, then that's the time to step back. And it doesn't mean you completely push off responsibility, but you need to allow some autonomy and for people to build their own teams. And frankly, you just can't do everything. So I think it's happened progressively. If anything, we probably could have done it faster. I think the trap again as a founder is a lot about the business, and you'll often you can probably get a better decision in some cases, but often the better decision, if you're just forcing it down the team's throat, it doesn't end up being the best decision for the business. You're often better to let a not perfect decision be made, so the teams are learning, they're understanding. Obviously, got to correct if it's way off, but just allowing people to make decisions, move on, learn, make mistakes, learn from that, I think creates a stronger executive team, which ultimately creates a stronger business.
Sure. And has the company changed at all internally from being a private company to being one that's publicly listed? Thankfully,
I don't think really at all. Clearly we're a bigger company. It's given us the ability to complete acquisitions. We did one. We've done a few recently. So there's certain benefits you get from being public. I think you can get downsides in that you're more visible in some senses, or people. You obviously have to report publicly, so there's a lot more visibility externally into what you're doing. But I think from a staff point of view, we've managed to maintain. The IPO was just a point along the way. It wasn't a change in our culture. It wasn't a change in what we do. It wasn't a change in the way we serve our customers. I mean, it was literally just a financing point along the way. And from a staff point of view, I think by and large, staff have been. We've kept that smaller company feel. Staff are engaged. We've really worked on that, and I think that's been good for us. Clearly as we get bigger, we've got to keep working on that. But I think it's so far been we've been pleasantly surprised at how little it's changed.
That's great. In my interview with Nadir, he kind of mentioned that he really enjoys the reporting aspect that it puts on the business. Do you think that that's something that early stage businesses should get in the habit of?
I think having strong or decent governance doesn't have to be certainly not the level of a public company, but having good governance. So an example would that be having a board early. I think that's just a good discipline to get into. I think companies that don't have a board early on and just run it almost as a management team, I think the risk there is you're not stepping back from the business. And I think we benefited from having an independent board fairly early within the first few years of our journey, and that it enables you to bring talent into the business and talent from outside of the business and a more experienced talent often, so you can get directors that have done it before. Obviously that's great, but then all of the compliance around. I mean, there's certain things. We had a few issues along the way around some legal issues and other things that we may not have had if we had better compliance. So there's certainly areas that we learned from during over the years that getting some of that wrong up front takes time to fix. The thing I say to any founder and startup is also get your structures right up front. Too many businesses start. I don't think we were perfect on this. We at least put some thought into it, but some businesses kick off, they set up their business and never really thought about the ownership structures, how they want to, if there's a potential to go to the US, have they thought about how they might top hat the business or move it to a Delaware corp? Are they better to do that day one? Those sort of considerations. Often people forget about the structure and the legals around the business and then wonder why that's a problem down the track. And I mean, everything from agreements between the founders, and with Rob and myself being two founders, it wasn't too much of an issue, but we still had an agreement between ourselves in terms of how things would operate if one of us were to leave the business. You want to go off down a path, you're looking at the next 10 years of building a business. One of the founders leaves after a year and they're carrying a chunk of equity. So we basically had a vesting schedule that we would vest out over the first, I think it was 4 or 5 years, whatever it was. But and so those sort of things often companies don't think about. But even personal structures, like how do you own your shares in the business, get the right tax advice. So those sort of things, I'd advise any company to do it early. Okay, it might cost you 20 grand worth of legals, or whatever it is, but it's worth spending it to get it all set up properly.
Sure, and I'm really mindful of your time, but just quickly, in terms of a board, what do you think makes up a good board for an early stage startup?
So I think a diversity of skills clearly, but also people who I think have been operational, where we've benefited from having a board that's quite operational. They've either run businesses before or been closely involved with advising growing businesses. I think operating execs who move onto boards are great. People, but I think at the end of the day, I mean that's all important. And I think the worst thing is, of course, somebody who's doesn't understand. People who don't understand the role of the CEO, it can be dangerous. You by all means have one or two on a board, but if you don't have anybody on your board who's actually been a CEO, I think that can make it hard as the CEO, because there's a certain, or as CEO founder, there's a certain level of, a certain way you operate. You get this pointy part of the business where you've got kind of the exec team coming through to your management team, the board pushing down. It can be quite a lonely place, and having a board that's never worked in that environment I don't think is as understanding of what you're going through as a CEO. I think the other thing I'd say is just being supportive. I mean, having a board that's supportive, the skills, you can tick off all the skills and that's great, but if you don't get along with your board, I mean, just have a board that's supportive, is passionate and about what you're doing as a company. Again, you can choose to have different types of people on a board. If they don't get what you're doing, if they're not passionate about it, then get somebody else. I mean, you want a board that also believes that you can change the world in what you're doing, that believes that what you're doing is important, that understands the impact it can have, and that in many ways is more important than the skills you bring onto the board. I think you can always find the skills, but it's often harder to find the passion for what you're doing. But so we've been very fortunate with our board to have people that were early investors, so they clearly had a skin in the game, so to speak, but they're also passionate about what we're doing. And we still have a board that's made up of people that invest in our very first round, through to people who've got public company experience. But the one thing that right across is they're very passionate about what we're doing, and they're prepared to engage and really get their hands dirty. And I think a board that's floating up too high and isn't engaging with the business is not going to be much help.
Sure. Lee, thanks a lot for your time today. For anyone that wants to get in touch, find out more about you or Aconex, how can they do that?
So drop us a line, either or through the website. Drop me an email as well. It'd be pretty easy to work out what my email is. And we should say that Rob and I also, one of the things we've really enjoyed is being able to invest back into startups, support a number of startups. So we've, aside from doing what we do day to day here, we think there's an enormous opportunity within the Australian startup ecosystem. I think we've got some incredibly talented people in Australia, and I think it's just really encouraging to see what's happening within the technology sector. Even within our sort of subset of that, within construction technology, we've identified about 40 startups in construction technology that the company Aconex is supporting. So, if you're doing anything around construction, get in touch. Either the company or Rob and myself personally, I'd love to talk to you and support what we can in terms of growing a greater technology ecosystem in Australia, and particularly around construction technology.
Lee, thanks a lot for being so open and sharing your story and your insights. It's been it's been a blast interviewing you.
Thanks. Good to talk to everybody. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to episode 22 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Lee, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Next week, I interview Paul Bassett, the co-founder of Seek and co-founder of Squarepeg Capital, one of the premier venture capital firms in Australia. Later this week, I will be hosting a live podcast session with special guest Adrienne Stone. Adrienne is an angel investor and founder of the Angel Cube Accelerator program. Adrienne mentors and guides startups that are in concept stage, assisting them to develop their businesses, investment pitches, and provides connections to investors in Australia, Silicon Valley, New York, and UK. If you're in Melbourne, I would love to meet you in person. You can register for the event by going to startupplaybook-adriennestone.eventbrite.com, or you can find the event details on our website at startupplaybook.co. Until then, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the next episode.